LLC operating agreements, why you absolutely need one, how to write it, and how to plan for ownership changes. Keep in mind that an LLC, limited liability company, operating agreement allows you to structure your financial and working relationships with your co-owners in a manner that fits your business. In the agreement, you and your co-owners set each owner's ownership percentage in the LLC, share of profits or losses, and many more. Find out the whole deal. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of the awesome Sweetie Kiwi Show. How you doing today? I'm feeling awesome. And if you're doing as great as I am, go grab a cup of coffee or tea or vodka and let's roll. Today, I want to talk to you about LLC operating agreements, why you absolutely need one, how to write it, and how to plan for ownership changes. Now, let's talk about why you need an operating agreement for your limited liability company. Many states do not legally require your LLC to have an operating agreement, but honestly, it would be foolish to run an LLC without one, even if you are the sole owner of your company. An operating agreement will help you guard your limited liability status. It will preserve you against financial and management misunderstandings and make sure, and this is very critical, that your business is governed by your own rules, not default rules created by your state. Now, protecting your limited liability status. The main reason why you want to have an operating agreement is to help ensure that courts will respect your limited personal liability. This is critical in a one-person LLC, a single-member LLC, where without the formality of an agreement, the LLC will look a lot more like a sole proprietorship. So having a formal written operating agreement will lend credibility to your LLC's separate existence. And that's the key words here, separate existence, so that you are able to preserve your limited liability status. You also can use an operating agreement to define financial and management structure. Now, this is important, especially when you have a multiple member LLCs as opposed to a single member LLC. So those are called co-owned. So a multiple member LLC is also called a co-owned LLC. This kind of LLC gotta document their profit sharing and decision-making protocols, as well as their procedures for handling the departure and addition of members. Because the last thing you want is somebody dies within the company or somebody leaves the company and the company the whole LLC has to dissolve and you got to start over. Not cool, right? So without an operating agreement, you and your co-owners will be ill-equipped to settle misunderstandings over management and finances. Besides, your LLC will be subject to the default operating rules created by your state law. Now, with an LLC, you can also override state default laws. Now, each state in the union has laws that set out specific operating rules for LLCs. Now, some of which will govern your business unless your operating agreement says otherwise. Right? So when I'm talking about default rules, I'm talking about the rules that authorities in your state have put in place to govern any kind of company that falls within the LLC category. Many states, for example, have a default rule that requires owners to divide up LLC profits and losses equally, regardless of each member's investment in the business. Think about that, right? Think about that. So let's say, for instance, you have 10 members in your LLC and you brought like 95% of the money, and the other 9 members they brought like maybe 0.5%. And at the end, something happens. You have no operating agreement, and the state says no, the profit has to be distributed equally. So each member is getting 10% of the profits, whereas you are the one who brought 95%. So you can actually counter this sort of adversary scenario by writing an operating agreement. That way you can choose the rules that will govern your LLC's inner workings rather than having to follow default rules that may or may not be right for your LLC. I'll be right back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of Sweetie Kiwi. We also continue our conversation around LLC operating agreements, why you absolutely need one, how to write it, and how to plan for ownership changes. What do you include in your operating agreements? How do you write one? Now, when it comes to operating agreements, there are a lot of templates out there, but regardless of the templates you have, there are a few issues, there are a few topics you absolutely need to cover in your LLC operating agreements. Now, most of this will depend on your business's particular situation and needs. Most operating agreements include the following: the member's percentage interest in the LLC, the member's rights and responsibilities, the member's voting powers, how profits and losses will be allocated, how the LLC will be managed, rules for holding meetings and taking notes, and buyouts or buy-sell provisions, which determines what happens when a member wants to sell his or her interest, when a member dies or becomes disabled. Now, you might be thinking that these items are straightforward, and they are. However, each requires you to make some important decisions, which you should definitely spell out in your operating agreement. Let's talk about the percentage of ownership. As I said earlier, the default rule at the state level is to divide everything equally. Maybe you want to divide the percentage of ownership based on the contribution of cash, the contribution of other assets. How do you allocate a percentage of ownership to someone based on the property they contributed if they have not contributed cash, right? So those are things you have to really think about. And also distributive shares. So in addition to receiving ownership interest in exchange for their contribution of capital, LLC owners also receive shares of the LLC's profits and losses. This is called distributive shares. Think about it in terms of it's like dividends for the shareholders in a C corporation. But for an LLC, you don't call those dividends. You call them distributive shares. Now, you have to also think about the distribution of profits and losses. So in addition to defining each owner's distributive share, your operating agreement should answer these questions. For example, how much, if any, of the LLC's allocated profits must be distributed to LLC members each year? Can members expect the LLC to pay them at least enough to cover the income taxes they'll owe on each year's allocation of LLC profits, right? Will distributions of profits be made regularly, or are the owners entitled to draw at will from the profits of the business? Those are little things, among others, that you need to cover in the operating agreements. You also need to think about the voting rights. Whether you want each member's voting power to correspond to his or her percentage interest in the business, or you want each member to get one vote, which is called per capita voting. Remember though that most LLCs, they will mete out votes in proportion to the member's ownership interest. Now, whichever method you choose, make sure that your operating agreement specify how much voting power each member has, as well as whether a majority of the votes or a unanimous decision will be required to resolve an issue. And you want to put a percentage, not just say, you need to define what unanimous means. Or you want to define what a majority of the votes be. Is it 50%? Is it 51%? Is it 60%? Is it 75%? Whatever it is. Another thing we need to talk about in the operating agreement is the buyouts or buy-sell provisions. In other words, ownership transitions, right? Many new business owners, they neglect to think about what will happen if one owner retires, dies, or decides to sell the owner's interest in the company. Things happen, folks. Life happens. People get tired. People are just, you have conflicts, you have harmony, and then you have disharmony. People are just trying to fight. You want to have legal structures around to manage those disagreements, and an operating agreement will help you do that. So an operating agreement should include a buyout scheme. In other words, rules for what will be for what will happen when a member leaves the LLC for any reason. I'll be right back right after this. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks, to another edition of Sweetie Kiwi. We are still talking here about an LLC operating agreement. And I was talking to you earlier about the ownership transition. We're going to continue on that conversation here. But if you love the clarity and quality of the content so far, please consider subscribing to our channel and turn on the notification bell. We really appreciate that. Please comment below, share, and like this content. Now, how to plan ahead for LLC ownership changes. Let me first kind of go back to what I said earlier about a buyout or buy-sell agreement. Now, contrary to popular belief, a buy-sell agreement is not about buying and selling companies. Instead, it is a binding contract between co-owners of a business that govern what will happen when an owner wants to leave or a new owner wants to join. Now, because of this confusion over terminology, we'll use the term buyout agreement here. So, a buyout agreement controls the following business decisions. Can a departing member force the other members of the LLC to buy him or her out? Who can buy a departing member's share of the business? Right? This could include outsiders or be limited to other LLC members. It depends on the constitution of the company and some kind of trade secrets. Maybe you don't want other people to get into the company or buy out a departing member. What is the price for a member's interest in the LLC? What other events can trigger a buyout? Remember, though, that a buyout agreement is similar to a prenuptial agreement between you and your co-owners, right? So if your happy union does not last, the buyout agreement spells out in advance what will happen to the business you own together. Now, what events are covered under a buyout agreement? There are myriads events that cover a buyout agreement. Typically, the events that trigger the buyout of a member's interest under a buyout agreement are a member's retirement or resignation. You have an attractive offer from an outsider to purchase a member's interest in the company. You have a divorce settlement. Yes, these things happen. Life will catch up to a member, for instance. So a divorce settlement in which a member's ex-spouse stands to receive a membership interest in the company. The foreclosure of a debt secured by a membership interest. The personal bankruptcy of a member. Or the disability, death, or incapacity of a member. Now, why do you need a buyout agreement? I think I've been saying this all along this show. If you have no clarity in your operating agreements or you have no operating agreements, state default rules will apply, and you don't want that. In addition, it is a huge mistake to ignore the fact that sooner or later your circumstances will change. Now, a buyout agreement can help in several situations. For example, a member leaves, and this can happen. Without a buyout agreement, the LLC might be automatically dissolved when one member leaves, forcing the asset to be sold and divided among the LLC members. If the other members wish to continue the business, there are no rules determining in advance whether and how the party member will be bought out or for how much. And this could lead to serious personal and business antagonism, perhaps even court battles and the loss of the business. If you have a new member who wants to join, you need to have a buyout agreement, because that agreement will place control on who can buy a membership interest in the company and how new members can join your ranks. Without this provision, another member could sell his or her share to someone you would rather not in business with. A buyout agreement also encourages a discussion of expectations, which is critical in life and in business. So in addition to avoiding potential problems in the future, a buyout agreement has a wonderful benefit in the sense that it will force you and the other members of your ownership team to talk about your hopes and expectations for the business. So this type of honest conversation will put your LLC on the right track from the very start. And I also want to talk about how do you create a buyout agreement. Now, a buyout agreement can have several clauses in your written operating agreement, or it can even be a separate agreement that stands on its own. Now, to create one, you can either use a self-help resource or see a lawyer, or both. All right, so this is it, folks. This is a conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. You learned something. You learned a lot. And LLC operating agreements, why you need one, how to write it, and how to plan for ownership changes. The recap here is very simple. Why you need an operating agreement, what to include in your operating agreement, and how to plan ahead for LLC ownership changes. I will see you another time, but until then, remember, stay marvelous.